Chapter 1. The Vanishing House. Daniel Carter drove in silence, his fingers tight on the steering wheel as his car rumbled over the uneven dirt road. The headlights cut through the mist, revealing the winding path ahead, flanked by dead trees that stretched upward like withered limbs. He had been driving for hours, leaving behind the comfort of the city for the forgotten village of Black Hollow, a place barely marked on any map, a place that no one seemed to talk about unless pressed. And Daniel knew how to press. He had spent years chasing stories, exposing truths buried beneath polite smiles and carefully constructed lies. But this was different. This wasn't corruption or scandal. This was something darker. The story had first surfaced online, buried in obscure forums and whispered through conspiracy threads. An entire family had disappeared overnight. No signs of struggle, no bodies. The house they lived in remained untouched, as if they had simply ceased to exist. And yet, the villagers refused to acknowledge that they had ever been there. Daniel didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't believe in curses or demons or whatever local legends might have tried to explain the disappearance. But he did believe in cover-ups. Someone knew something, and he was here to find out what. As he entered Black Hollow, the air itself seemed to change. The village was small, nothing more than a handful of old houses clustered together, their wooden frames sagging under the weight of time. There were no streetlights, no signs of modern life. Even the few villagers he passed looked worn, their faces hollow, their eyes avoiding his gaze. It was the silence that unsettled him the most. No birds, no distant murmur of conversations, just the faint howl of the wind as it slithered through the empty streets. He slowed the car as he reached the edge of the village. Beyond a stretch of withered cornfields stood the house, the vanishing house. Even from a distance, it felt wrong. It was old, but not in the way abandoned places usually were. The paint was chipped, the windows dark, the door slightly ajar. But the structure itself was intact, unnaturally so. There was no overgrowth swallowing it up, no signs of nature reclaiming what had been left behind. It was as if the house resisted decay. Daniel parked the car and stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots, the only sound in the suffocating stillness. As he approached, a strange sensation crawled up his spine, a whisper of something unseen brushing against his thoughts. Go back. The thought came unbidden, slipping through his mind like a voice not entirely his own. He shook it off. Nerves. That was all. The front steps groaned under his weight as he climbed them, pausing at the doorway. The door hung slightly open, swaying just enough for the hinges to moan. He hesitated. His pulse thrummed against his ribs, an instinctual warning buried deep in his gut. Then he pushed the door open and stepped inside. Inside the hollow, the air was thick, stale, clinging to his skin like damp cloth. The house smelled of dust and something else, something faintly sweet, like rot masked by artificial perfume. The living room was frozen in time. A table still set for dinner, plates and silverware untouched. A child's toy car resting mid-floor as if dropped in the middle of play. The fireplace held cold ashes, undisturbed. Everything was perfectly still, as if the family had simply stood up and vanished mid-movement. Daniel reached for his phone and snapped a few pictures, but the moment he checked the screen, his stomach twisted. The photos were distorted, not by motion blur or bad lighting. The walls looked warped, stretched at unnatural angles, and the furniture, Some of it was missing in the images. A chair in one shot was absent in the next, despite him not moving an inch. He swallowed hard and turned toward the fireplace. A single framed photo sat on the mantelpiece. A mother, a father, 2 children, smiling. At first glance, it was just an ordinary family portrait. But as he leaned in, his breath hitched. Their faces were blurred, not by dust, not by the passage of time, but deliberately erased, smoothed out, as if their very existence had been stripped away. A chill wrapped around his spine. He turned the frame over, searching for a name, a date, anything. There was nothing. It was as if they had never existed at all. The wooden floor above him groaned. Danielle froze. It was not the sound of a house settling. It was movement, deliberate, slow, as if someone or something was shifting its weight just above him. He reached for his flashlight, clicking it on. A beam of pale light cut through the darkness, illuminating the staircase at the end of the hall. The sound came again, a faint creak, closer this time. Daniel's pulse pounded. He took a step forward, the floor beneath him protesting. Then, from the top of the stairs, something shifted. A shadow, a figure standing just beyond the light's reach. It did not move, did not speak, but he felt it staring, watching. His breath hitched as the flashlight flickered, the beam shuddering against the walls. And then, just before the light cut out entirely, he saw it. No eyes, no mouth, no face at all. Just a smooth, hollow void where its features should have been. The flashlight went dead, and in the pitch-black silence that followed, the only thing he could hear was breathing. Not his own. Something else. Something close. And it was coming closer. Chapter 2. Whispers in the dark darkness swallowed the house. Daniel's breath was shallow, his pulse hammering in his ears. He gripped the flashlight in his trembling fingers, clicking the switch frantically. Nothing. It was dead. The air around him felt wrong, too thick, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. And in the silence, he heard it, breathing, slow, measured, not his. It was close, too close. His body screamed at him to run, to bolt out the door and never look back. But years of chasing stories, of forcing himself into the unknown, kept him frozen. If he ran now, he might never understand what he had just seen, if he had seen anything at all. Maybe it was his mind playing tricks on him. Maybe exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere had gotten to him. He had read about this before, how isolation, fear, and expectation could create hallucinations. But he knew that wasn't true. He had seen something. He forced himself to take a step back, his boot scraping against the wooden floor. The breathing stopped. Then, a whisper. It wasn't a word. It wasn't even a language he could understand. It was a sound that slithered into his ears like wind through dead leaves, dry and rasping. It sent a shiver down his spine, triggering something primal, something that told him he shouldn't be here. The whispering grew, overlapping, a dozen voices speaking in hushed, desperate tones. The floorboards above him groaned as if shifting under unseen weight. Daniel fumbled in his pocket for his phone, pulling it out with clumsy fingers. He pressed the power button. Nothing. The screen remained black. The whispering stopped. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming down the stairs. His heartbeat was a thunderous roar in his chest. He took a step back toward the door, his instincts finally screaming louder than his curiosity. The darkness ahead was total, but he could hear it moving, closer, closer. His fingers brushed the doorknob, ice-cold metal. He twisted, locked. A sharp exhale left his lips. He hadn't locked it when he came in. The footsteps reached the bottom of the staircase. Then they stopped. Silence. A pause that stretched too long, stretching so thin it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Then, a voice, right beside his ear. "You shouldn't be here." Daniel spun, his hand yanking at the doorknob with full force. It wouldn't budge. He could feel something just behind him, close enough that if he turned, it would be there. He could almost feel it staring at him, even though it had no eyes. The whispers surged again, rising into a frantic, overlapping cacophony. The air was thick, suffocating. Then, something touched him. A feather-light brush against his wrist. Cold, dry, unnatural. His mind snapped. He slammed his shoulder into the door. Wood cracked, hinges groaned. Another hit. His body screamed in protest, but he pushed harder, desperate. On the third impact, the door burst open. Cold night air hit him like a slap. He stumbled forward, nearly falling down the steps, gasping as he turned back toward the house. The doorway yawned open, black and silent. The whispers were gone. The house stood there, still and empty, as if nothing had happened. But Daniel knew better. He staggered back to his car, fumbling for the door handle. His hands were shaking. He had spent years chasing stories, diving into danger without hesitation. But this was something else. His fingers wrapped around the key in the ignition. He hesitated. He could leave right now, drive away, pretend he never came. But he wasn't done. Not yet. The mystery wasn't just inside the house. It was in the village itself. The way the people had looked at him. The way they had refused to speak about the missing family. Daniel took a deep breath and turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. His stomach dropped. He tried again. Click. Nothing. Then he saw it. In the reflection of his windshield, a figure standing on the porch. No face. Just smooth, empty skin where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, and then, ever so slowly, it raised its hand and waved. Chapter 3. The Faceless Ones. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He couldn't look away from the figure standing on the porch of the vanishing house. No face, no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, empty skin where features should have been. And it was waving at him. The motion was slow, deliberate, unnatural, a mockery of human interaction. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to drive, to get the hell away from this place. He twisted the key in the ignition again. Click. Nothing. The car refused to start. He was trapped. His eyes flicked back to the porch. The figure was gone. A cold shiver ran down his spine. It hadn't moved. He hadn't seen it move. It had just disappeared. His fingers fumbled for his phone. Dead. Just like his flashlight. Just like his car. The realization settled over him like a suffocating weight. Whatever this was, it wasn't normal, and it wasn't going to let him leave. A noise, a soft shuffle, like footsteps on gravel. His eyes darted to the side mirror. A shadow moved at the edge of his vision, just beyond the reach of the dim moonlight. It was circling the car. Daniel's breath hitched. Another shadow. And another, more of them, the faceless ones. They moved without sound, gliding rather than walking, their bodies distorted in the low light. They didn't rush toward him. They didn't try to open the car. They just stood there, watching, but they had no eyes. A sharp tap on the driver's side window. Daniel flinched violently, a strangled gasp escaping his throat. His head snapped toward the sound. Nothing, just the glass. His own reflection staring back at him, wide-eyed, pale, panicked. Then, his reflection blinked. Daniel didn't. His stomach dropped. His reflection wasn't mimicking his movements. It was staring at him, independent of him. Then, slowly, it lifted its hand and pressed it against the glass from the inside. Daniel recoiled, his body slamming against the passenger door. His mind scrambled for logic, for an explanation. This isn't real. This isn't real. The reflection tilted its head, its expression twisting into something wrong. Its features began to shift, to melt, until its face was wiped away completely, leaving only a smooth, empty void. A hollow face. Daniel let out a choked cry and shoved the door open, stumbling out of the car. The night air hit him like ice, sharp and cutting. The faceless ones were gone. The house loomed in silence behind him, its dark windows like gaping mouths. The village was dead, empty. His only option was to run. He bolted down the road, his breaths ragged, his boots kicking up dust as he sprinted back toward the village. The road stretched on longer than he remembered, the darkness pressing in, the silence deafening. Then, a voice, soft, whispering, "Daniel." He skidded to a stop, his heart nearly leaping out of his chest. It had come from behind him. He turned slowly, every muscle in his body screaming at him not to. The house stood where it had always been, still, watching. But the front door was open now, wide open, and standing just inside was a figure, not faceless, a woman. Her features were blurred, as though she was standing behind frosted glass. She lifted her hand, beckoning him. "Daniel." The voice was familiar, too familiar. His mother's voice. Daniel's blood ran cold. His mother had been dead for 10 years. He took a step back. The woman took a step forward. "Come inside, Danny. It's okay." His breath hitched. His mother had called him Danny when he was a child. No one else had ever called him that. His mind screamed at him to run, to get out, but something rooted him in place. The woman took another step. Her face was still blurred, still wrong. "Don't you recognize me?" Her voice was warm, gentle, exactly as he remembered. But he knew this wasn't her. His mother was gone, and whatever was standing in front of him was something else, something wearing her voice. His body finally obeyed. Daniel turned and ran. Behind him, the whispers rose into a chorus of voices, overlapping, echoing his name. The last thing he heard before he reached the village was a single, distorted sentence. "You're already home, Danny." Chapter 4. No Way Out. Daniel ran. The cold night air burned his lungs, but he didn't stop. His boots pounded against the cracked road leading back into the village, his breath ragged, his pulse a frantic drumbeat in his ears. The whispers behind him had faded, swallowed by the silence of Black Hollow. But he didn't dare slow down. The faceless things, whatever they were, had been toying with him. He knew it. They could have done more, could have taken him, but they hadn't. Not yet. That was the worst part. They were waiting. He reached the edge of the village, gasping for breath. The streets were still empty, the old wooden houses standing in eerie silence. Not a single light glowed from a window. No movement. It was as if the entire village had been abandoned years ago. But it wasn't. Daniel had seen the villagers earlier that day. They had been here, watching him, pretending everything was normal. Where were they now? He forced himself forward, passing the row of houses. The mist had thickened, curling between the buildings like something alive, slithering toward him. Something was wrong. He should have reached his motel by now. It wasn't a big village, but the road stretched on too far, longer than it should. The houses were repeating, their shapes identical, their windows dark and empty. His stomach twisted. He turned sharply, cutting across the nearest yard, hoping to take a shortcut, and stopped. He was back on the same road, the same row of houses, the same mist creeping at his feet. His breathing quickened. He turned again, darting between two buildings, sprinting toward the next street, and emerged on the same road. The realization hit him like ice water. He wasn't leaving this place. The village wouldn't let him. A door creaked open nearby. Daniel spun toward the sound. A single house, identical to the others, had its front door ajar. A faint, flickering light pulsed from inside, casting long shadows across the porch. Then, a footstep. Someone was inside. He should have walked away, should have ignored it, should have fought against the sick curiosity clawing at his mind. But he didn't, because the moment he turned to leave, the whispers started again, low, insistent. Danny. His mother's voice. His chest tightened. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe. It's not her. It's not her. It's not her. But his feet carried him forward anyway, up the steps, through the door, inside the house. The moment Daniel stepped inside, the door swung shut behind him. The room before him was a living room, old but untouched by time. A single lamp flickered in the corner, casting weak light over the floral wallpaper, the dusty couch, the fireplace, and the photos. Framed pictures lined the walls. Daniel stepped closer. His breath hitched. They were all of him. His childhood, his teenage years, college graduation, even moments he had never remembered being photographed. Sitting alone in his old apartment, walking to work, standing in front of his car just days ago. His entire life, documented. His blood ran cold. A soft shuffle echoed behind him. He turned sharply. A woman stood in the doorway leading to the kitchen. His mother. No, not her. The thing wearing her face. She smiled, stepping forward. "Danny, sweetheart," she cooed, voice soft, loving. "You look tired. Come sit down." His throat was dry. His muscles refused to move. The woman reached out, her fingers brushing his wrist. Ice cold. "Don't be afraid," she whispered. Daniel yanked his arm back. His skin prickled where she had touched him. He took a shaky step away, his back hitting the wall. The woman's smile twitched. Then, she blinked, and her face vanished. A smooth, empty void replaced her features. No eyes, no mouth, nothing. Daniel choked on a gasp. The whispers flooded the room. A movement in his peripheral vision. The photos, they were changing. The images of his past twisted, distorting into something awful. In every picture, his own face melted away, erased. And in their place, the faceless ones, standing beside him in every memory, watching, waiting. Daniel's stomach lurched. His mind screamed at him to run. The woman reached for him again. This time, she grabbed his arm and pulled. Daniel felt the floor disappear beneath him. He was falling into darkness, into nothing, into the hollow. dissolved into nothing. No ground, no sky, no walls. Just an abyss of endless, swallowing darkness. He tried to scream, but the sound never came. It was as if the air had been sucked from his lungs, leaving only silence. Then, impact. His body slammed into something solid, but it wasn't the floor. It wasn't anything. It was like hitting the surface of a frozen lake, except the ice wasn't real. It rippled beneath him, distorting like liquid before hardening again. Daniel groaned, pushing himself up. Darkness stretched infinitely in all directions, but beneath his feet was something wrong, a surface that shouldn't exist. It was like standing on a mirror, but instead of reflecting him, it showed shifting images beneath his boots, scenes, memories, his memories. Daniel's hands trembled as he looked down. The images below him flickered, snapshots of his past appearing in fragments, scattered across the glassy void. There, his childhood home, his mother tucking him into bed. The memory shimmered, twisting. His mother turned toward him, her features warping, her face gone. Daniel stumbled back, his pulse hammering in his ears. Another memory flickered to life beneath him. College dorm room, his old friends laughing, drinking, celebrating. Then, distortion. Their faces melted away, replaced by smooth, empty voids. No, this wasn't real. It was an illusion, a trick. The faceless ones were inside his mind now. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to focus. This isn't real, he muttered through gritted teeth. This isn't real. The void shuddered. The shifting surface beneath him cracked. A voice whispered through the darkness. But it is. Daniel stiffened. The voice was his own. Slowly, he turned, and there, standing just a few feet away, was himself. A perfect copy. Same clothes, same unshaven face, same wide, terrified eyes. But something was wrong. Daniel stared at his doppelganger. The copy stared back. Then, it smiled. A wide, unnatural grin that didn't belong on his own face. You don't belong here, the copy whispered. Daniel took a step back. His duplicate took a step forward. The crack beneath his feet spread. The void trembled. But you were always meant to come back. The voice was wrong now, distorted, layered with whispers that weren't his own. The doppelganger lifted a hand. Daniel's breath caught. The fingers were wrong, elongated, stretched too thin. The skin peeling away, revealing nothing underneath, just emptiness. A void where flesh should have been. You were one of us once, Danny. The thing stepped closer. It's time to come home. The cracks beneath Daniel's feet splintered outward like a spider web. The surface beneath him was breaking apart. No, he wasn't staying here. He wasn't going to let them take him. The faceless ones had trapped him inside their hollow world. But he wasn't one of them. He refused to be. Daniel took a deep breath, and he ran. The glass-like surface beneath him shattered. Darkness surged upward, swallowing everything. The last thing he saw before he was consumed by the void was himself, smiling. Chapter 6. The Other Side. Daniel plummeted. The void swallowed him whole, wrapping around his body like ice-cold tendrils. His limbs flailed, reaching for anything, anywhere, but there was nothing to hold on to. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing against his lungs like unseen hands. Then, just as suddenly as he had fallen, he stopped. Not with a crash, not with a jolt, just stopped, as if gravity itself had changed its mind. Daniel's body trembled as he pushed himself up, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was was somewhere else now. Not the hollow abyss, not the village, but a room. A cold, dimly lit room. The walls were aged and cracked, streaked with black mold that curled like skeletal fingers toward the ceiling. A single flickering light bulb hung from a wire above, casting sickly yellow light. The air smelled damp, rotten. Daniel's stomach twisted. He wasn't alone. Something was breathing in the dark, slow, shallow. His heart pounded as he turned his head. A shadow sat hunched in the corner, not moving, not speaking, just watching. The dim light barely reached it, but he could make out the shape. A human figure curled inward, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Daniel swallowed hard. Who are you? The shadow didn't answer. Then, it twitched, a jerky, unnatural movement, as if its body was waking up from something deep, something unnatural. Daniel took a step back. The floor creaked beneath his weight. The shadow's head snapped up. Daniel's breath caught. Its face. There wasn't one. A smooth expanse of skin where eyes, a nose, a mouth should have been. But worse, it was wearing his clothes, his jacket, his jeans, his boots. No, this wasn't just a faceless thing. It was him. Daniel staggered backward, his entire body screaming to run. The thing moved, not walking, gliding. It stepped into the dim light, its head tilted slightly, as if studying him. Then, it opened its mouth, or rather, a hole formed where a mouth should be. A sound poured out, low, gobbled, like someone speaking underwater. The words twisted, shifted, until they became his own voice. You were never supposed to leave. Daniel felt cold dread crawl up his spine. What? What do you mean? The thing took another step. You came back. No, I never lived here. I don't belong here. Daniel's voice shook. The faceless thing laughed, a hollow, warped mimicry of his own voice. Don't you remember, Danny? Something in the room shifted. The walls breathed, expanding, contracting, as if they were alive. And then, the photographs appeared, lining the walls, hundreds of them. Daniel's stomach churned as he stepped closer, his eyes scanning the images. They were of him, but not just from his past. There were pictures of him in this room, sitting in the corner, sleeping on the rotting mattress in the corner, standing in the doorway. Some of them were old, faded. Others were recent, as if they had been taken just now. Daniel's breath came in short, panicked gasps. No, this isn't real. The faceless thing smiled. Oh, but it is. The room suddenly tilted. The walls pulsed. The air thickened, pressing in around him. Daniel stumbled back, his mind spiraling. This wasn't possible. He had never lived here. He had never been here before. Had he? The faceless thing took another step. It's time to wake up, Danny. A hand shot out, fingers wrapped around Daniel's wrist. Cold, so cold. Daniel screamed. The room collapsed. Darkness swallowed him again. And then, a sudden blinding light. A voice. Sir, can you hear me? Daniel's eyes snapped open. He was lying on his back, grass beneath him, the sky above, gray, cloudy. A man in a security uniform was kneeling over him, his face etched with concern. Jesus, we thought you were dead. What the hell happened to you? Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. Where am I? The security guard frowned. You're in Black Hollow. We found you passed out by the old village sign. You've been missing for 3 days. Daniel's blood turned to ice. 3 days. His hands trembled as he pushed himself up, his entire body aching. He looked around wildly. The village was there, silent, empty, unchanged. was wrong. A group of villagers stood in the distance, watching, not moving, just like before. And then, just beyond them, at the edge of his vision, a figure stood on the porch of the vanishing house, waving. No face, no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, empty void. Daniel's pulse spiked. His own voice echoed in his skull. You were never supposed to leave. Chapter 7. The Mark of the Hollow. Daniel's body was shaking. The security guard was still speaking, but his words blurred together, distant and meaningless. All Daniel could focus on was it, the faceless figure on the porch. It was still waving, not frantic, not aggressive, just slow, mocking, like it knew something he didn't. Daniel tore his gaze away, forcing himself to breathe. I need to get out of here, he muttered, staggering to his feet. His head throbbed, his limbs felt weak, but he didn't care. Every instinct screamed for him to run. The security guard frowned. Are you sure you're okay? Maybe you should sit down. No. Daniel's voice was sharper than he intended. I just need to leave. Now. The guard hesitated, then sighed. All right, but you should know. He paused, lowering his voice. Something's wrong with this place. The people here, they won't talk about it, but they know. Daniel's blood ran cold. Know what? The guard's jaw tightened. That once this place gets its hands on you, it never really lets go. Daniel's stomach twisted. He didn't respond. He couldn't. Instead, he turned, forcing himself to move, away from the village, away from them. The road stretched ahead, shrouded in mist, and for the first time, it didn't feel like it was looping anymore. Leaving Black Hollow, Daniel drove. The motel, his car, everything was still there, untouched, as if nothing had happened, as if the past 3 days had been a fever dream. But he knew the truth. The memories were still too raw. The faceless things, the shifting house, the mirror world beneath his feet, his own voice telling him he had been here before. The security guard's words gnawed at him. Once this place gets its hands on you, it never really lets go. Daniel clenched the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. No, I got out. It's over. But was it? Something was wrong with him. He could feel it, like something had burrowed inside his skin, just beneath the surface. An itch he couldn't scratch, a pressure at the back of his skull, and then, as he caught his own reflection in the rearview mirror, his breath hitched for just a second, just a fraction of a second. His face had blurred, like something was trying to erase it. Daniel slammed the brakes. His heart pounded against his ribs, his breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. He stared into the mirror, wide-eyed. His face was normal again, shaky, pale, drenched in sweat, but normal. Had he imagined it, or was something still inside him? The thought made his skin crawl. He swallowed hard, gripping the wheel with trembling hands. It's just in my head, he whispered to himself. It's over. I'm out. I'm out. The road stretched ahead, empty, silent, but as he pressed the gas and drove forward, the itching beneath his skin didn't stop, and deep down, in the part of his mind he didn't want to acknowledge, he knew Black Hollow wasn't done with him yet. Chapter 8. The Hollow Follows. Daniel drove through the night, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His body felt heavy, like something unseen was pressing down on him, sinking into his skin. The road stretched endlessly ahead, empty and dark, swallowed by the thick fog that clung to the pavement like grasping fingers. He had escaped, or at least he thought he had. But something was wrong. The itching beneath his skin hadn't stopped. It had only gotten worse. It wasn't just an itch anymore. It was a presence, something lurking just beneath the surface, crawling through his veins. His pulse pounded in his ears. His breathing was uneven. His mind screamed for him to stop the car, to pull over, to look at himself. But he didn't. He couldn't, because deep down, he knew. If he looked in the mirror again, he wouldn't like what he saw. The marked miles blurred into nothing. The town of Black Hollow was long behind him now, nothing more than a memory. But the further he drove, the more reality felt off. The highway signs looked unfamiliar. The gas stations he passed were nameless, empty. Even the sky seemed wrong, too dark, too still, like a painting that had never been finished. And then the humming started. Low, almost imperceptible at first, a vibration beneath his skin, a whisper at the base of his skull. Daniel clenched his teeth, trying to block it out, but it was inside him, a soundless echo crawling through his mind, weaving itself into his thoughts. Something was whispering, not in words, not in language, but in feeling, a sensation of return, of home, of belonging. Daniel's grip on the wheel faltered. No, his voice was hoarse, barely more than a rasp. You're not real. You're not inside me. The humming grew louder. His vision blurred for a split second. And then, the road was gone. The road that shouldn't exist. Daniel's foot slammed the brakes. The tires screeched. The car jerked to a stop, skidding slightly on the pavement. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart hammering against his ribs. The road in front of him was different. No streetlights, no signs, just a long, winding path leading into the woods. But that wasn't possible. This wasn't where he was driving. He had been on the highway. This road, he knew it. It led back. His stomach twisted. No, this isn't real. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers slick with sweat. He pressed the power button. The screen flickered. Then, black. The device died in his hand. Daniel exhaled sharply, gripping his temples. His mind was slipping, warping, or maybe the world around him was. The humming grew, and then a hand pressed against his window. Daniel's body locked up. Slowly, so painfully, slowly, he turned his head. The breath left his lungs. A figure stood outside his car. It was him, or at least it was wearing him. His own face stared back at him through the glass. Except it was off. The skin was too smooth. The eyes were just slightly wrong. The mouth too still. Daniel's doppelganger lifted a hand and pointed down. Daniel followed its gesture. His breath caught. His own reflection was missing. The side mirror reflected everything. The trees, the road, the car, but not him. He was gone. The hollow. Takes a sharp cold pain lanced through Daniel's skull. He gasped, clutching his head as the humming turned into a roar. Something was being pulled away from him. No. Something was being replaced. His skin felt loose, like it didn't belong to him anymore. His fingers trembled as he lifted them to his face. His cheek felt wrong. The texture was smooth, too smooth, like fresh wax, like it was being wiped clean, like a blank canvas. No. He threw the car door open, stumbling out onto the pavement, gasping for breath. The figure, his other self, was gone, but his reflection was still missing. Daniel clutched his face, his nails digging into his skin. "I'm still me," he whispered. "I'm still here." And then, a voice, his own voice. Are you? A new sensation crept into his mind. Not fear, not horror, but something worse. A faint, distant acceptance, as if some part of him, some deep, buried part of him, already knew the truth and had known it all along. Chapter 9. The Vanishing Self. Daniel stood in the middle of the road, his chest rising and falling in ragged, panicked breaths. The forest around him was silent, too silent. No wind, no insects, no rustling leaves, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then the whisper came, not from the trees, not from the road, but from inside him. Let go. Daniel clutched his head. No, I'm still here. I'm still me. But the itching, the unbearable, crawling sensation beneath his skin was worse than ever. Something was shifting. Something was changing. And with growing horror, he realized it wasn't just his reflection that had vanished. It was his memories, the unraveling mind. What was his mother's name? What was the name of his childhood pet? Where had he been driving before he ended up in Black Hollow? The answers should have been simple, obvious, but his mind came up empty. Panic surged through his veins. He staggered back, his vision blurring. The world felt like it was warping, stretching, tilting at unnatural angles. The more he tried to hold on to himself, his thoughts, his identity, the more it slipped through his fingers, like his very existence was being rewritten. No, I won't forget. Daniel dug his nails into his arm, his breathing ragged. Pain was real, but then his skin didn't feel like his anymore. The texture was wrong, too smooth, too blank. His pulse spiked. Trembling, he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. It was still dead, but the black screen reflected a faint, ghostly outline. His face, or at least what was left of it. The edges of his features were fading. His cheekbones, his jawline, the curve of his mouth, all were blurring, like something was erasing him from existence. His knees buckled. Oh God. A sound broke the silence, a laugh, his own voice. Daniel's head snapped up. There, standing in the middle of the road, was him. Or at least the thing pretending to be him, the faceless doppelganger. Only now, it wasn't entirely faceless. It had his smile. His lips curled into a slow, eerie grin. It's almost time, Danny, it whispered. You don't need to fight it anymore. I am not you. Daniel's voice cracked. You're not real. The thing took a step closer. Aren't I? Daniel stumbled backward. No, this wasn't happening. He was real. He was Daniel. He had a life, a past, but the memories were slipping further, like a book with pages being torn out. His childhood home, gone. His first kiss, gone. His own name. His chest heaved. No, I'm still me. The thing smiled wider. Then tell me, who were you before Black Hollow? Daniel opened his mouth and froze. His mind was empty. No name, no past, no self. No, this isn't real. His hands clawed at his face, desperate to feel something, anything. But his skin was smoother than before. The last of his features were fading. He was disappearing, and the thing standing before him was becoming him. It's okay, the doppelganger whispered, reaching out a hand. It's time to come home. The forest trembled. The road stretched endlessly. The air hummed with unseen voices. Daniel's body swayed. He was so tired. Maybe it was easier to let go, to stop fighting, to become part of Black Hollow. Chapter 10. Hollowed Daniel's breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. The faceless thing stood before him, wearing his smile, his voice, his presence, becoming him. And he was vanishing. His mind was unraveling, his memories slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. The harder he tried to hold on to himself, the faster it all faded. His childhood, gone. His family, gone. Even the taste of his own name was starting to feel distant, like it had never truly belonged to him in the first place. No, I won't disappear. I won't. But his voice sounded wrong, distorted, hollow, like he was already less than he was a moment ago. And the thing standing in front of him, it was more. The breaking point. The air around him shifted. No wind, no movement, just a creeping, unnatural stillness. And then, a single sharp pain erupted in his chest. Daniel gasped, doubling over as an icy pressure coiled around his ribs, pulling. Something inside of him was being extracted, like invisible hands were peeling him away, layer by layer. He tried to scream, but the sound that left his throat was wrong, echoing, distant, as if it belonged to someone else. The faceless figure watched. It wasn't attacking him. It wasn't forcing this upon him. It was simply waiting for Daniel to finish unraveling, waiting to take his place. Stop, Daniel gasped, stumbling backward, but his legs felt weak. No, not weak, unreal. His fingers twitched, and for the first time, he noticed. His skin had lost all texture, smooth, pale, empty, like fresh clay, waiting to be molded. His reflection had been erased, and now his body was following. "You've been here before, Danny," the figure whispered. "You always come back." Daniel's heart skipped a beat, because somewhere, buried deep beneath the fear, beneath the unraveling memories, something inside him remembered. A feeling, a fragment, a glimpse of a past he had forgotten. This wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the second. He had been here before, many, many times. And each time, Black Hollow had taken a little more of him, until eventually, there would be nothing left to take. The final choice. The humming in the air grew louder, pressing against his skull, filling every part of his being. He could feel it now, the moment of finality. A choice stretching before him. Let go. Let the hollow erase him. Let the doppelganger become him. Let himself be swallowed into the endless cycle of Black Hollow. Fight. But how? There was nothing left of him. No past. No memories. No self. But maybe that's what Black Hollow wanted. To erase everything until there was nothing left to fight with. Maybe the only way to win was to hold on to something real. Daniel dug his nails into his arm, desperate for something, anything, solid, something that was his. Pain was real. His breath, his heartbeat, the feeling of dirt beneath his fingertips. He existed, and if he existed, he could fight. "I am not yours," Daniel whispered. "I will never be yours." The faceless thing tilted its head. For the first time, its smile faltered, and Daniel ran. To Chapter 11, The Hollow's Grasp. Daniel ran. His legs burned. His lungs felt like they would burst, but he didn't stop. The road was endless, stretching into the void, swallowed by the thick, unnatural fog. And behind him, the thing was following, not running, not chasing, just gliding. A slow, inevitable pull, like he wasn't escaping it, like it was pulling him back. "You can't leave, Danny." The voice echoed in his skull, slipping through his mind like poison. "You never do." Daniel gritted his teeth, forcing his body forward, even as the road beneath him twisted and warped. His body felt wrong, his skin tingling, his senses distorting, his vision blurring as if he was being peeled apart from the inside. But he refused to stop, because deep down, he knew. If he stopped, if he slowed, if he let the exhaustion win, he would never leave Black Hollow again. The fading path, the road shifted beneath him. One moment, he was sprinting down cracked pavement. The next, he was somewhere else. A forest, twisted, unnatural trees stretching into a black, starless sky. Their branches moved, reaching for him like skeletal fingers. And ahead, a house, not just any house. His house, the one from his childhood, a place he barely remembered, but recognized. Daniel's chest tightened. No, this isn't real. But his feet were already moving toward it, because something inside him whispered. If he wanted to escape, if he wanted to break the cycle, he had to remember. Inside the memory, the front door was open. Darkness bled from within. Daniel stepped inside. The floorboards creaked beneath him. Dust swirled in the stale air. The house was exactly as he remembered, or at least as much as he could remember. Old peeling wallpaper, a hallway lined with picture frames, a scent of something long abandoned, and then a sound, a faint whisper, coming from the living room. Daniel's pulse pounded. He swallowed hard and forced himself forward. The air grew thicker. The walls seemed to breathe. And as he turned the corner, he froze. There, sitting on the couch, was a boy, no more than 8 years old. Himself. The truth unveiled. The boy sat motionless, staring at the flickering TV screen. His tiny hands gripped a stuffed rabbit, its fur worn and matted. Daniel's throat went dry. This can't be real. The boy turned. His eyes met Daniel's, and in that moment, a flood of memories crashed into him. A birthday party, balloons, laughter, then sudden screaming. A night filled with sirens, red and blue lights flashing against the walls. The feeling of cold hands dragging him away, whispering that it wasn't his fault. Daniel staggered back. His hands trembled. This was why he had forgotten. Because the truth was too horrible to remember. He had lost his family that night. A fire. One that shouldn't have happened. One that someone had caused. And the worst part, it had been him. Not on purpose. Not intentionally. But he had been the reason the flames had started. He had been the reason they never made it out. Daniel's breath hitched. No, that's not true. I didn't. The boy on the couch smiled, and the voice returned. Do you see now? The house shuddered. The walls cracked. The ceiling began to collapse. Daniel's knees buckled. The weight of the truth pressed down on him, suffocating, crushing. And from the shadows, it emerged. Not his doppelganger, not the faceless thing, but something worse. A mass of shadows, shifting, writhing, taking shape. Not into a single form, but many. 100 faces, 1,000 whispers, all of them people he had forgotten, all of them people he had lost. You can't run from this, Danny. The shadows curled around him, tightening. You never could. Daniel gasped, struggling against the darkness, against the weight of his own guilt. Was this why he had come back? Had he been running from himself all along, or had Black Hollow been calling him home? The shadows pulled him down, and for the first time, Daniel realized. Chapter 12. The Last Reflection. The shadows tightened. Daniel couldn't breathe. The weight of 100 lost voices, 1,000 forgotten memories, pressed into his skin, into his soul. The thing in the darkness whispered, "You've always belonged to Black Hollow." His body was sinking, dissolving into the abyss. His hands were vanishing, his skin melting into the same faceless void that had consumed so many before him. This was it, the final moment, the end of Daniel Mercer. Unless the last choice. A memory flickered, a single moment buried beneath all the horror. Not the fire, not the guilt, something before that. His mother's voice. No matter what happens, Danny, you are still you. Something inside him snapped. Daniel clenched his teeth. No, no, I am still me. The words weren't just spoken, they were screamed into the void. And for the first time, the darkness shuddered. The figures reeled back, their whispers turning to distorted screeches. Daniel pushed forward, clawing his way out of the abyss. Pain tore through him. His skin burned, his muscles screamed, but he fought, because this wasn't just about escaping. It was about taking himself back, piece by piece, memory by memory. The shadows break. A high-pitched shriek tore through the air as Black Hollow began to fracture. The shadows lashed out, wrapping around his arms, his legs, his throat, desperate to hold him down. His doppelganger emerged from the void, its face still blank, but its mouth stretching in a grotesque mockery of a grin. "You can't leave." Daniel gritted his teeth. "Watch me." His hand shot forward, grabbing the stuffed rabbit from the boy's grasp, and the world exploded. The walls of Black Hollow shattered like glass. The faceless thing howled, its body convulsing, collapsing into a swirling mass of darkness. And then, everything went silent. The void collapsed inward, pulling all of Black Hollow into itself. The voices, the figures, the shadows, the doppelganger, all of them screaming as they were swallowed into the abyss. Daniel felt himself being flung forward, and then light, the awakening. Daniel's eyes snapped open. Cold air rushed into his lungs. He was lying on the ground. His body ached, his head throbbed, but he was alive. Slowly, he sat up. The road stretched ahead, empty and silent. No sign of the fog, no sign of Black Hollow. And in his hands, the stuffed rabbit, old, worn, but real. His fingers tightened around it. It was proof that he had been there. Proof that he had survived. The memories were still fresh, raw wounds in his mind. But for the first time, they didn't feel like chains. They felt like his. And that meant he could move forward. The town that watches. Daniel stood up. Behind him, Black Hollow was gone. Or at least, it looked like it was gone. But deep in his bones, he knew it was still there. Watching, waiting. Because Black Hollow wasn't just a place. It was a prison for the lost. A place for those who carried too much guilt, too many secrets. It had called him back because he let it. But now, he wasn't running anymore. And that meant Black Hollow had no power over him. For now, he turned away, and without looking back, he walked into the morning light. Epilogue. The cycle continues. Somewhere deep in the place where Black Hollow once stood, a whisper lingered. A shape moved in the darkness. A new figure. Someone else had wandered too far down the wrong road. And soon, Black Hollow would have another visitor. Because the town never truly disappeared. It just waited. For the next lost soul. For the next Daniel Mercer. For the next nightmare to begin. The end.